distinct honor of introducing Bill Rapai, who is not only Grosse Pointe Audubon president, yes, I believe, but also he's the executive director of the Kirtlands Warbler Alliance. This is a nonprofit formed in 2013 to support Kirtlands warbler conservation. He's also the author of The Kirtlands Warbler, the story of a bird's fight for survival and the people who saved it, published in 2012 by University of Michigan Press. And I have to say that it's one of my favorite books, and it reads like a novel. So I highly recommend it. And so without further ado, I'd love to welcome Bill Rapai.
Thank you, Juliet. Thank you for that very warm welcome. And I would love to get a hold of your diversity statement. If you would email that to me, I would love to employ it at Grosse Pointe Audubon and potentially with the Kirtlands Warbler Alliance.
Absolutely.
I think it's something that we should be considering ourselves.
We worked with Michigan Audubon and on our statement, and we're pretty proud of it. So there you are, sharing your screen. Yay.
Okay, so let's move this thing over here so I can hit the play button. And now, come on, play. There we go. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Let's back up so you can see the Kirtlands Warbler there. He should be singing. Let's try it again so you can hear him. I hope you can hear him singing. Thank you very much for inviting me. I deeply appreciate it. As I said to Juliet a few minutes before everybody joined us, there's been a lot of news about the Kirtlands Warbler recently. And last time I spoke to Washington Audubon, it was just after the release of the book. And you know, when you have a book to sell, you kind of have to go out there and sell it. So since then, I kind of got sucked into being, doing more with the Kirtlands Warbler. After I was finished writing the book at what I thought would be my last meeting of the Kirtlands Warbler recovery team, somebody pulled me aside after I was saying all my goodbyes, and he said, "You're not going anywhere. The jack pine has a way of calling you back." And that's exactly what has happened. So a little bit about me. I know Juliet gave me a quick introduction. I'm not a biologist. I'm not a scientist in any way. I am a former newspaper guy. I cut my teeth in Grand Forks, North Dakota, at the Grand Forks Herald. I worked for many years at the Detroit Free Press until the strike of '95. Then I worked for the Boston Globe, started having babies, and began writing books. And so that's pretty much my story in the shorthand. And there's the book on the Kirtlands Warbler, which Juliet was kind enough to do a little commercial for me. It was published in 2012 by University of Michigan Press. So what is exactly the Kirtlands Warbler Alliance? Well, we were formed in 2013 to support the conservation team. One of the things that we have done so far is we've raised about $60,000 to help pay for a position, a part-time position of a coordinator for the Kirtlands Warbler conservation team. Somebody who will plan meetings, keep the conversations flowing, keep people in the loop, keep the communications going with a newsletter, and reach out to the public. We're going to continue to raise money for that position because that is a position definitely in need. Human dimensions. This is a fairly new field. I don't know if anybody is familiar with the idea of human dimensions, but let's just say that it's not the birds that need to be managed anymore. It's more the humans. And so human dimensions is pretty much everything that's not directly about the conservation. We work with state and federal lawmakers and policymakers every year. We visit with people in Washington, in Lansing, and soon we'll be talking to people in Madison, Wisconsin, just to help them understand how important Kirtlands Warbler conservation is, how far we've come, and what we need to do in the future. And we continue to reach out to people to help them see the economic benefits of Kirtlands Warbler conservation. People really don't realize how much money comes into small towns like Grayling and Mayo every year from people who come from all over the world, literally, to see the Kirtlands Warbler. Not only is it just people who come into those communities to see the Kirtland's warbler, it's also the timber harvesting that happens, all the economic benefits from that. Our other job is to act as a watchdog, and we're going to dig into that a whole lot later on. So this is hardly a news flash at this point. As you probably all know, the Kirtland's warbler is no longer considered to be an endangered species. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in October 29 approved a rule change that removed the Kirtland's warbler from the endangered species list. It took nearly a decade of consideration and planning. This was not something that a decision that was made overnight. This was not some decision that was made in the Trump administration to throw this bird essentially to the sharks. It took a very long time to make this decision, and in fact, the Fish and Wildlife Service does not want me to say this, but they dragged their feet intentionally just to make sure that they were going to be making all those I's were dotted and all those T's were crossed. So our goal as the Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Team is to build a new model for endangered species conservation. With the Kirtland's warbler coming off the endangered species list. So what you may be asking at this point is different about the Kirtland's warbler from any other species that is currently on the endangered species list or has been removed from the endangered species list. And that is, it's because the Kirtland's warbler is what is considered a conservation reliant species. It means that we will need to continue to rely on humans to perform conservation work on the Kirtland's warbler behalf for as far as we can see into the future, period. This is a fairly new concept. It was developed in the past 10 years by a gentleman by the name of J. Michael Scott, who is a senior scientist with U.S. Geological Survey. He's also a professor at the University of Idaho. He led the conservation effort for the California condor. He's leading efforts to conserve native birds in Hawaii. And through his research, he came to realize that more than half of the species that are on the endangered species list simply cannot be removed from the endangered species list. They are like on life support. The endangered species list is life support for these species. And if they were taken off the endangered species list, they simply would not be able to survive on their own. So there are a couple of things that he realized along the way is that these species require a couple of things: predator control, of course, parasite control, habitat management, and these things must continue even after a sustainable population is achieved. Perhaps the biggest poster child for the idea of a conservation reliant species is the Bengal tiger, which is in trouble because of human persecution and loss of habitat. And we need to do everything that we can, and will need to do everything that we can to preserve the Bengal tiger for as far as we can see into the future. So what causes a plant or animal to be placed on the endangered species list in the first place? Well, generally it's because of four things. There are some other things, but these are the four big ones: habitat loss, like with the Florida panther that you see there on the right side of your screen; human persecution, which is the case with the wolves; competition from invasive species, which is what caused the blue pike, which is the Lake Erie subspecies of the walleye pike to go extinct. And of course, environmental factors, things like DDT, which caused the bald eagle and peregrine falcon and other species to go into severe population declines decades ago. For the Kirtland's warbler, we can point to two of the four, and those would be habitat loss and invasive species. Juliet, I think she said that the Kirtland's warbler was particular about their nesting demands. That would maybe be a little bit polite. I would say that they're particularly persnickety about their nesting demands. They require young jack pine trees, sandy soil. The jack pine trees need to be between 5 and roughly 20 years old, certain size, with overlapping lower branches to protect the nests because the nests are built on the ground. They want sandy soil because if they built the nest on clay soil and it would flood, the eggs would simply die. They would become not viable very, very quickly if the nests were to flood. So it's very, very, very persnickety. Therefore, because this area that the Kirtland's warbler nests in is not particularly large, its population will always be small. And there you can see Sarah Rockwell, who is an ornithologist. She got her PhD at the University of Maryland doing research on the Kirtland's warbler, and you can get a really good feel for what the Kirtland's warbler habitat looks like. Blueberries in the foreground, jack pine trees, and other trees in the background. Well, of course, one of the problems that we have is that we've taken fire out of the landscape. And if there's no fire, we have no new habitat created. Fire is an absolutely critical part of the Kirtland's warbler landscape. Everything here is built to burn. And when the tops of the trees burn, those long dormant plants come up from their roots underground. The blueberries and the sweet ferns and the sedges all pop up from underground. They've been dormant for 30, 40 years, but they come right back to life and everything begins new again. Of course, the other thing that has helped to drive the Kirtland's warbler to the edge of extinction was the impact of the brown-headed cowbird, the invasive species. Brown-headed cowbird is not exactly native to this area. It is native to the Great Plains. It was connected to the bison herds. And when we wiped out the bison herds in the late 19th century and we cleaned out the trees in northern Michigan through lumbering at the same time, the cowbird began to wander across the landscape. And when they came into northern Michigan, they found these new prairies. They were very, very happy there. So 1923, a young man from Chicago by the name of Nathan Leopold was the first to identify the threat. He organized a expedition to northern Michigan to search for the Kirtland's warbler. I won't go into the backstory of Nathan Leopold, but you probably are all familiar with Leopold and Loeb, the infamous murderers from the early 1920s. Anyways, he was the first to identify the threat of the cowbird by watching the cowbirds interact with the Kirtland's warblers in the field. So what we have here is a Kirtland's warbler nest, 3 Kirtland's warbler eggs, and 1 brown-headed cowbird egg. And you can see that they are very similar in size, in coloration, the spots. So it would be easy for a Kirtland's warbler to say, there's that's my egg. You would think that a Kirtland's warbler might, leave the nest to go get some food and come back and say, wait a minute, I laid 3 eggs and now there's a 4th one in my nest. What's going on? But it's most likely the Kirtland's warbler had 4 eggs in the nest, and the brown-headed cowbird laid an egg and then removed one of the Kirtland's warbler eggs to disguise its presence. Of course, the cowbird will hatch first, it will be larger, it will hoard the food, and it will likely push the one or more of the young Kirtland's warblers out of the nest. If this were the ratio, that 1 cowbird to the 3 Kirtland's warblers, perhaps 1 Kirtland warbler would survive. If there were any more cowbirds than that, none of the Kirtland's warblers would survive. At one point, the predation rate for the Kirtland's warbler by the cowbird was somewhere around 75%. And with that kind of predation rate, the population simply was not sustainable. So what will it take going forward? Well, it all starts with population monitoring. When a species comes off the Endangered Species List, the Fish and Wildlife Service is required to monitor the population for 5 years post-delisting. For the Kirtland's warbler, that has been extended out to 15 years, and it could be extended further. The number one thing that we need to do is monitor potential threats. Yes, the brown-headed cowbird population is way down across eastern North America. I know that a couple of people say that they have been seeing cowbirds, but the population is down across eastern North America, and that is really showing up big time in the Kirtland's warbler areas, because last year there was almost 0 cowbird predation in the jack pine. The other threats are from things like the jack pine budworm, which you see there in the photograph. That guy does a whole lot of damage to the jack pine trees and could potentially, in a big year, a year of a large hatch, could potentially wipe out vast areas of jack pine trees. So that makes this year's census even more critical than it has been in the past. The census actually began in 1951. It was a project of, it was a concept idea of Harold Mayfield. We'll talk a little bit about Harold Mayfield in a little bit. You could make a very good argument that it prevented extinction because we had a very good idea of what the Kirtland's warbler population was like in 51, 61, and 71. And when we saw it take a huge dip between 61 and 71, we said, okay, it's time for action. If we had not recognized that this was happening, we could very well have missed it. So it has been proven as an absolutely valuable tool for protecting Kirtland's warbler population. It's an important post-delisting part of the post-delisting delisting monitoring. The last full census was in 2015. Initially, they were done every 10 years, starting in 1971. They were done every year until just about 2010. And then they went to 2 years, then they went to 3 years. Now they're going to 5 years. We missed last year. We're going to do it this year for sure. Usually the U.S. Forest Service uses some volunteers. I know that there are members of Waukesha Audubon who go up every year religiously. We deeply appreciate their contributions. I know the Forest Service does. And without them, we would probably not do nearly as thorough a job of counting the Kirtland's warblers. For the first time this year, the Michigan DNR is going to be using the U.S. Forest Service model and using volunteers. And it is my job to organize those volunteers, get them trained, and get them into the field. It has been a challenge. So we're now gearing up for 2021. So how is the census conducted? Well, people are assigned transects. Essentially, it's a 1 or 2 mile walk on a straight line through the woods. You use a GPS or a compass to set your bearing, and you follow that direction, and you follow a very strict protocol. You walk a certain amount of time, you stop and listen, you mark on your map the locations of the birds, and if you have somebody on either side of you, a quarter of a mile away on one side, a quarter of a mile away on the other side, at the end you stop and compare notes, and you say, okay, at this third stop I heard 2 guys over here, and so you'll compare with the person on the transect to your right. Or maybe at stop 10 you'll hear a couple of singing birds, and you'll stop and compare with the person who's on the transect of your left. You finish it up, go have lunch, and then you do it again the next day. Who can participate? Well, essentially you need to be in good health and have good hearing. It is a very challenging walk to walk through the jack pine. Jack pine can be very dense. It's over uneven ground. When jack pines are planted, the ground is rutted. So you have these ruts that you have to walk through, and there's often slash from old leftover cuttings. There's often stumps. So it's a real challenge. And of course, we need experienced birders. We need birders who can hear Kirtland's warbler and discern it from the other birds that they might hear in the area. Yellow-rumped warbler, or a Nashville warbler, or a purple finch, and say, okay, yes, that's a Kirtland's warbler and not something else. So we're taking a maximum of 40 people, and we're not interested in heroes. We don't want somebody who's going to go out there and say, I heard 30 Kirtland's warblers. This is in very many ways, we try to make this as conservative as possible to make sure that we're not overcounting birds, and we really don't want anybody to go out there and say, oh, I found more birds than you did, kind of thing. So let's quickly review how we got to where we are today. The Kirtland's warbler story is a uniquely Michigan story. There are 2 monuments to the Kirtland's warbler in northern Michigan. The one on the left is on the lawn of the Oscoda County Courthouse in Mayo, and the one on the right is at the Grayling Rest Area. We know that the Kirtland's Warbler inspires passion because how many people do we have on the call tonight? The last I looked, it was 93 or something, and that's just terrific. I'm sure that people are here to hear about the Kirtland's Warbler because they're as passionate about it as this guy here. This is the leg of one Mike Petrushka, who anytime there is a Kirtland's Warbler opportunity to volunteer, lead people on tours or whatever, he is there. And when he takes people out on a tour, he guarantees that they will see at least 2 Kirtland's Warblers. This is the tattoos. 1, 2 Kirtland's Warblers on the tattoo. I hope people, since I can't hear laughter, I'm hoping people got it. People come from all over the world to see it. And when they do, they go a little bit nuts. Now, this is not in Northern Michigan. This was at the Biggest Week a few years ago. Kimberly Kaufman let me use this photo. And there was one little Kirtland's Warbler over here in the brush. And you can see how many people that attracted. It was the star of the day. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Kirtland's Warbler migration, essentially they go from places in Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula. 95% of the population is in the area around Grayling, Mayo, Luzerne, over towards Tawas. 95% of the population is in that area. And they migrate to the Bahamas every year and they come back. Usually the first birds start arriving right around May 3rd. We've never seen them earlier than May 3rd. The bulk of the population begins to come in the second week of May. Right around June 1st, they've mated, they're on the nest, and they're ready to raise their young. The Kirtland's Warbler was one of those species that we did not know a whole lot about for a very, very long time. We knew that they were nesting, or we knew that they were spending their winters in the Bahamas because bird collectors were bringing birds out of there in the early part of the 20th century. They were shooting them and bringing them and putting them in their collections. But we didn't know where they breeded. We had no idea what their breeding population, where their breeding population went, where their breeding grounds were, until Norman Wood in 1903 discovered their breeding grounds. One of his students at the University of Michigan, Norman Wood, by the way, was a curator of birds at the University of Michigan Museum of Natural History. And one of his students heard a bird in northern Michigan while he was on a fishing expedition on the Ausable River. He did not recognize the song. So what did he do? He shot it and he brought it back to Ann Arbor. And he presented it to Norman Wood. And Norman Wood immediately recognized how important this discovery was. So he traveled for 3 days to northern Michigan and he discovered the nest of the Kirtland's Warbler. And that nest is actually in the collection at the University of Michigan Museum of Natural History. He dug it up and shipped it back to Ann Arbor, including the young birds that were in it. Unfortunately, the young perished on the trip. But that nest, that first nest discovered, is in the collection. 1931, a dentist from Battle Creek, Lawrence Waukesha, began to do research on the Kirtland's Warbler. Lawrence Waukesha is probably more famously known for his research on cranes around the world. The only crane species that he did not get a chance to see was in Russia, the Siberian crane. Otherwise, he traveled the world to do research. But he was the first person to band a Kirtland's Warbler. He was a dentist, and the Fish and Wildlife, what was before the Fish and Wildlife Service, allowed him to band Kirtland's Warblers for research because they figured he was a dentist and he had really deft touch, because he was, operating in people's mouths and things, so he would be gentle with the birds. Interesting story about Lawrence Waukesha is he also got married in 1931, and he and his wife spent their honeymoon in a tent in northern Michigan, so Waukesha could get up and do his research on the Kirtland's Warbler. People also would see him in the bush with blood trickling from around his hairline on his forehead, on his neck, because he had so many black fly bites from sitting there and monitoring the Kirtland's Warbler populations as they moved around on their breeding grounds. 1930s and 40s, Jocelyn Van Tyne became the premier researcher on the Kirtland's warbler. And Van Tyne is the ornithologist whose name is synonymous with excellence. One of the AOU's, what was the AOU's top research awards is named after Jocelyn Van Tyne. He began to do much of the research in the 1930s. So Waukesha stepped aside and he did his work on cranes. And he really took the knowledge about the Kirtland's warbler to a different level. And he was preparing to write a book on the Kirtland's warbler when, unfortunately, he died of heart disease. But working close with Van Tyne was this gentleman, Harold Mayfield, who was a businessman from Toledo, Ohio. He was a semi-pro basketball player in his youth, but he suffered a stroke in his 20s, an amazingly early age to have a stroke. So since he could no longer play basketball, he looked around for something to do. He contacted Van Tyne and said, "Could I come into the field with you? I'm curious about learning more about birds." Well, when Van Tyne died, Harold Mayfield took all of Van Tyne's notes and wrote the book, the first book on the Kirtland's warbler. And essentially, Mayfield's book is essentially, in essence, emptying his field notebooks and Van Tyne's field notebooks onto the page. Just all kinds of notes, no narrative, just notes. But two things that Mayfield did that are critically important. He persuaded the state of Michigan to set aside land for nesting. He recognized that the Kirtland's warblers always needed to have some young jack pines. And he persuaded the state of Michigan to always have jack pines in rotation so that there would always be nesting areas. And he, in a conservation first, he established the first annual census of any species on Earth. Prior to this time, nobody had attempted to do an entire census on any one species. And it's fairly easy because you know where the Kirtland's warblers are going to be. If you can find young jack pines on sandy soil, you can probably find Kirtland's warblers there. And so what you see there is somebody making notes about the birds that they saw in the field while they were walking their transect. In the 1960s and 70s, the Kirtland's warbler unfortunately became a symbol of conflict. In May 5th, on May 5, 1980, the U.S. Forest Service was preparing land for Kirtland's warbler nesting areas. And the fire got out of control. It spread across the landscape. It burned through the small town of Mack Lake. One Forest Service worker was killed in attempting to extinguish the fire. And it was an absolute disaster for the Kirtland's warbler and the Forest Service. It set their efforts back for years. But it turned out that that fire happened at the absolute best time, because when the new trees began to come online from this burn, it essentially saved the Kirtland's warbler population by providing them with a vast new area for them to nest in. And the biologists went in and they said, "Oh, we now understand how we should be planting these trees. We now understand how we should be, attracting Kirtland's warblers to these areas." And it really changed the ballgame. And you can kind of see how the population began to take off in the early 1990s as a result of the Mack Lake fire. The Mack Lake fire was in 1980, and it took a little bit while longer for those trees to come on line than most trees, but about 10 years later, you can see that population begin to steadily grow. And that takes us to pretty much where we are today. The conservation goals have been met. Delisting was required by law. So in 2018, the Fish and Wildlife Service applied for a rule change to remove the Kirtland's warbler from the Endangered Species List, and it was approved in October of 2019. So these are members of the Kirtland's warbler conservation team. I would be in the picture, except for they needed somebody to take it, so that was me. What you're looking at are people from the U.S. Forest Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Michigan DNR, the Wisconsin DNR, Ohio, the University of California in Pennsylvania, the American Bird Conservancy, Canadian Wildlife Services. They're all there. And you're looking at about, well more than 150, maybe 200 years of experience working with Kirtland's warbler in that group. And it's no longer about recovery. Everybody has shifted the thinking, and now we are looking ahead. It's all about conservation going forward. We've begun implementing work plans. We're designing plans that are going to guide us into the future of how we are going to plant trees for the Kirtland's warbler and manage the land in the future, not just here, but also on the wintering grounds in the Bahamas. We're developing plans for human interventions for Kirtland's warbler conservation, reaching out to people to help them understand why it's so important that this work needs to continue. As I said earlier, we are identifying threats and developing mitigation plans. And we're expanding the breeding range beyond Michigan, or at least beyond that core breeding range in northern lower peninsula into the upper peninsula and Wisconsin. Currently, there's about 100 pairs that are not nesting in that core area. So there are some in the UP, some in Wisconsin, some in Ontario. The goal is in the next few years to expand that to about 200 pairs. And the reasoning behind that is because if some terrible thing were to happen in that core breeding area, we would have a hedge. We would have these birds spread out across the landscape so that we could then potentially rebuild the population from those birds that are elsewhere in Ontario and the UP and Wisconsin. So we're also in the middle of a whole bunch of long-term experiments. And one of those, the goal of these experiments essentially is to raise the value of jack pine trees at auction. Currently, the money that comes in from the sale of a tract of land to have the jack pine lumbered is less than what it costs to replant it. So we are now doing jack pine conservation, Kirtland's warbler conservation at a loss. Up until the time of the Kirtland's warbler coming off the Endangered Species List, that money was made up from Washington through endangered species funds. Now it's a little bit dicey. So the Forest Service and the Michigan DNR are looking at ways to increase the value of the jack pine at auction. Let me see if I can find my notes here. We are now working on increasing or decreasing, actually, we're experimenting with stocking densities. The typical acreage, the trees are typically planted at about 1,300 trees per acre. We are looking at taking that down to as low as 1,200 or 900 in some areas. The reason for that is because the trees are kind of squished in there. They're packed in there right now. The trees do not get a chance to grow as large as they could be. And so if we pack the trees in a little bit less densely, it could allow those trees to get bigger and be more valuable. We're also looking at lengthening rotation times. Right now, it's about 40 to 50 years when a plot is cut. We're looking at extending that out to potentially 60 years to let the trees grow a little bit larger and have them be worth more. We're also talking about thinning out stands. Potentially every third tree could be cut down, which would allow more room for the trees to grow. And also, we're planting more red pines. Red pine is a more valuable tree at auction. So the more red pines, the more valuable that tract will be when it goes up for sale. The question is, of course, how will the birds respond? We don't know yet. We'll begin to get an idea this year when that first experimental tract from the Michigan DNR will be tall enough, old enough that the birds will begin to occupy it. So here is one of the U.S. Forest Service's experiments. What you're looking at is the areas that are in green are going to be planted with high density. Then you're going to have some areas of low density and medium density. And then, oops, somebody have a question? Okay. There are going to be low and medium areas. And then there's going to be areas that they're simply going to allow to naturally regenerate, where you see open. So the trees that do leave seeds behind, they're just going to allow those to naturally regenerate. And then they're going to be studying the where the birds go, what they prefer. This is I believe, a 537 acre plot, and 300 of these acres will be planted in the usual high density, and the rest of them will be experimented with in lower or no packing. We're working also to improve the winter habitat in the Bahamas. Dave Ewert, who has been working in the Bahamas for decades on Kirtland's warblers, is now doing some experiment with the Bahamas National Trust to see if goats can be used to generate new areas for Kirtland's warblers to spend the winters. As you know, goats pretty much eat just about everything, but they don't necessarily like the plants that Kirtland's warblers like. Those are wild sage and black torch and snowberry. They would prefer to eat the trees that are growing in emergence. Well, we want to keep the trees from growing up high enough that will shade out these berry plants. So we're now working with farmers, goat farmers in the Bahamas, to let them eat certain areas underneath power poles, for example. So the power companies no longer have to come in and cut underneath the trees. They just let the goats graze underneath the power lines, and that keeps the vegetation from growing up into the power lines. And it also opens it up for Kirtland's warblers. So there's a potential there for a real win-win. COVID's had a really big impact on planting, unfortunately. It hasn't had a one on the bird, of course, but there were fewer acres planted in spring of 2020. The U.S. Fish and or excuse me, the U.S. Forest Service did not plant any of their land last year. The Michigan DNR was able to plant all of their trees last year, but we are really struggling to get trees in the ground for the past 10 years. They have limited Kirtland's warbler tours this year. The U.S. Forest Service is not having any. The Michigan DNR and Michigan Audubon is having tours out of Heartwood Pines. And I urge you, if you are interested in seeing a Kirtland's warbler, the slots are filling up fast. So if you want to see a Kirtland's warbler on a tour this spring, make your reservations quickly. I believe it's at the Heartwood Pines website. You can do that. And the DNR is having a bit of a budget crunch. They had some real budget cuts because of COVID early on. So they were not spending a whole lot of money on Kirtland's warbler research or anything this past year. But here's the biggest concern with the Kirtland's warbler, and that is the trees simply are not getting in the ground. The overall target is to have roughly 34,397 acres of suitable breeding habitat for the Kirtland's warbler in any one year. The DNR and the Forest Service traditionally have had a goal of planting 3,830 acres per year. That number was recently reduced to 3,441 because the Forest Service did an analysis and they thought that if they chose the best acreage to plant every year for the Kirtland's warbler, rather than just putting it across the landscape, they would be able to have the same response from the birds on fewer acres. Fingers crossed, they're right about that. But between the Forest Service and the DNR, we have come nowhere close to meeting the annual planting goals. In 2016, only 1,737 acres were planted. In 2018, only 1,524 acres were planted. In 2019, only 1,520 acres were planted. So you kind of get the idea that we are heading into a real habitat bottleneck. Which is likely to lead to a decline in the Kirtland's warbler population over perhaps the next 10 to 20 years. By the year 2025, we are looking at an estimated 22,000 acres of suitable breeding habitat available. So that's down about 12,000 acres. So you can see that the birds are likely to begin falling in their population. If we continue to replant the acreage at the goal of 3,400 acres every year, it will take us until 2035 to get back to our 34,000 acre number. So that means that we're really kind of close to dipping below 1,000 pairs again in the not too distant future. And the trigger for putting the Kirtland's warbler back on the endangered species list is 1,300 pairs. So yeah, we have a problem and we have to solve it. And we're not really sure how that's going to happen. The problem with the Kirtland's warbler and species like the Kirtland's warbler is if you see something like a decline in population, it's usually too late to affect it. So we're at a real crossroads with the agencies. And that's when our organization kind of steps up and says to management in Washington and Lansing, hey, you're not keeping your end of the bargain. And we're going to see if that's going to make a difference or if we're going to have to continue to hound them. So why does this one bird matter? Well, one of my favorite quotes is from Aldo Leopold, of course, is to keep every cog in wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. But a few years ago, I wrote a book on invasive species in the Great Lakes. And when I was in the process of writing that book, it really was impressed upon me by the biologists who were working on the Great Lakes that if you take one thing, just one species out of the Great Lakes, it makes the entire ecosystem that much less resilient. You want, it makes it easier for that ecosystem to succumb to some shock, some invasive species, some terrible thing. It makes it easier. So keeping everything in that ecosystem as it is intended is really critically valuable to keeping the balance in that ecosystem. So how can you help? Well, Jack Pine Planting Day is coming up. It's May 1st, COVID permitting, knock on wood. If we all have our vaccines and we're planning to keep our distance out in the field, we're limiting the numbers to 20 this year, we should be able to hold Jack Pine Planting Day on May 1st. I invite you all to come if you're interested. You can sign up for the Jack Pine Planting Day. I'll provide you with an email. You can send me an email and I'll be happy to take you. I would say invite you to the census, but all the slots are filled. We didn't quite anticipate the response that we got. We set out to have 40 and it turned out we got 40 in no time at all. Would love to have you sign up for our quarterly newsletter just to keep in touch. I will share that email with you and you send me your email address. I will happily put you on the email address. Donate. Send us $5 or $10 because we can't do this all alone. We can't do this for free, unfortunately. We need a little money to help us do the things that we do, particularly with the census. We've built a website to train the participants on the Kirtland's Warbler census, and that's costing us about $5,000. We'd love to have you consider joining us for a committee or maybe even the board. Most importantly, I want everybody to remember that it's not just about the Kirtland's warbler. It's about the Kirtland's warbler, but not just about the Kirtland's warbler. It's all about the ecosystem. Everything in that ecosystem is critically important. The trees, the plants, everything works together. And if we lose one thing, we lose the entire, we run the risk of losing the entire ecosystem. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. Please email me at this rather ungainly email address, the Kirtland's Warbler Alliance @gmail.com. There's our address. I'll keep that on the screen a little bit longer, and I'm happy to take questions. I see Juliet's taking a picture of the email address. Thank you.
Okay, let's have a look at the chat. Thank you, Bill. That was
Keith
awesome.
has a question.
Keith has a question.
Keith?
Not primacy, but I am curious, Bill, when you think about the financial delta between what the DNR and other parties had wanted to plant and what they're going to be able to plant, what is the true cost to catch up? on an annual basis. Do you have any sense for that number?
About
How big is it?
500,000.
500,000 a year?
Yeah, it was about $500,000. Yeah. Yeah. So what we're doing is we're working with American Bird Conservancy to build an endowment. Our goal is to build an endowment somewhere in the neighborhood of $20 million, so we can have enough money to pay for the conservation work that needs to be done, plus research or any other thing that we need to do on an annual basis. So ABC is working on that, and we're helping them with that. But otherwise, our job is to support the conservation team in their efforts to, reach out to people and all the other things that they do.
It just seems to me, in an age of crowdsourcing for initiatives that people really care about, this is one that I would think that would garner a fair amount of attention if we could really harness that engine. And so I would.
We have never really tried crowdsourcing, and I'm going to make a note of that to consider exploring that with my board.
I mean, and I would be happy to help you think through that. I just, there's an opportunity here that I think the kind of passion you're eliciting just in this one talk here in this one county of Michigan is indicative of the power that could be harnessed if we could put our minds to it.
Thank you very much for the suggestion.
Thank you, Keith. That's great.
Where in the Bahamas do they nest? Do they spend the winter?
Uh-oh, we lost Bill.
Oh, that's not good. See
Oh,
the unfreezes here.
I hope so.
No.
There you are, Bill. So the question was, where do they winter in the Bahamas? What part of the Bahamas are they hanging out in?
Generally in the southern islands. Early, back in the 1950s, spending their winters on the northern islands that are more pine covered. And so when Dave Ewart's team of researchers began, they started in the Nassau area, and they got a phone call, and they were finding nothing. They couldn't find a Kirtland's warbler anywhere. So they got a phone call one day from
Unfortunate word.
a team of a group of birders that everything into the island. One of the things is that the Kirtland's warbler is nesting on Luther Cat, San Salvador, but they're finding it as far south as Turks and Caicos.
Hey, Bill, you're breaking up a bit. I think it's you, not us. I wonder if you would turn off your video, and that might spare some of your bandwidth.
Sorry, maybe.
Yeah, unfortunate, because the good news is it hung in there, right? The bandwidth hung in there for the majority of the talk. It's unfortunate that we're getting a little bit of freezing here now.
Breaking up, I'm having real trouble hearing.
Yeah, Bill, that's unfortunately the case. I was wondering if you might try turning off your video to conserve bandwidth.
Yeah, if I just totally flake out, we got pop.
While we're waiting for Bill to reconnect, I'll post his website again here, if you give me one moment. And if anyone has questions, they can always follow up with Bill over email.
So I think what Bill was saying was that the Kirtland's
He's back.
warblers are hanging out in the winter on the southern Bahama Islands, not on Grand Bahama.
I'm back.
Oh, you're back. Yay. Okay, so we didn't really hear the question about where they go in the winter in the Bahamas.
I'm sorry.
The
Yes,
answer, yeah.
they tend to be found farther south on the Coppice Islands. The Coppice is the predominant vegetation. It's scrubby. It's full of the berry-loving plants that the Kirtland's warbler likes. Initially we thought that they would be found in the northern islands that are more pine dominated. I thought, well, they're in pines in Michigan. Why wouldn't they be in the pines in the Bahamas? But it turns out they're not. They prefer those Coppice islands. But we found that they're a little bit farther across the landscape than we initially thought. We're seeing them in the southern Bahamas, Turks and Caicos. We saw one in Cuba a couple years ago. We saw one in Jamaica a couple years ago. So they are really spread out much farther than we initially thought.
Mhm. Interesting.
That said, the bulk of the population is probably in the central Bahamas, but we don't really know because we can find 50, 60 birds in the winter. And we know that the population is considerably larger than that, but the Kirtland's warblers in the winter is like, don't bother me.
Bill, I've got a question for you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the concern, of course, is the Bahamas and Mayo area, Oscoda, those areas up there by Grayling. But what about the birds that potentially fall into Washtenaw County? Do you want to get a specific, record of that, or be, notified when that occurs?
Well, we actually have one volunteer, Mike Petrushka, who I mentioned earlier with his tattooed leg. He keeps very, very precise records of Kirtland's warbler sightings on migration. And he has actually built a map that does a pretty good job of showing a correlation of where the birds, how the birds travel. Slightly different in the spring than it is from the fall. In the fall, the birds tend to travel a little bit more farther to the east than in the fall, and then in the spring. If people are putting their sightings on eBird, he follows that very, very carefully. He also follows the birders email listserv. Occasionally something will pop up on Twitter or whatever, and so we all kind of send him things. But if you have something that about that nobody else does, maybe some historical records, that would be great. I would love to see them and share them with Mike.
Yeah,
there-
I know Bruce Mormon, who's on this call, found a Kirtland's over at North Bay Park in Ipsy. And we did generate some reports and get them to Mike Petrushka. I know I sent him some of my photos and Karen Markey's photos. And we filled out the whole form. Bruce, I think you were involved in that, weren't you? No, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, in 2019, Carl Brenner and I found one in North Bay Park. And then in 2020, I found one at Waterworks Park in Ipsy. So,
I gotta admit that I am absolutely incredibly jealous of you guys in Washtenaw County. You get one every single year, and
Yeah.
I cannot find one. I'm out there every spring in here in Grosse Pointe, looking along the shoreline everywhere I can. I have yet to find one, but
We've had them for 3 years in a row. We had them the year before North Bay. We had one in Dolph Park right here in town in Ann Arbor. And then previous, it probably was maybe 8 years since we'd had a regular sighting. So they just are on a little run here for Washtenaw. We're
Nope.
expecting Bruce to find the next one.
all right, Bruce, no pressure.
Bill,
it
we
might
have
be a hard
questions.
year for me to find one. Basically, only days I can bird are on the weekends.
Hmm.
I'm watching my grandson there 5 days a week now. So,
Oh, good for you.
Bill, I was wondering if I could jump in. There was a question in the chat about the origin of the name Kirtlands. Could you speak to that?
As a matter of fact, I can. So in 1850, I'm sorry, maybe 1853 or so, a bird collector and scientist by the name of Charles Pease was on his father-in-law's farm west of Cleveland. And he saw a bird, and what do you do when you're, a biologist or an ornithologist in the 19th century? You shoot it. And so he shot the bird. He couldn't identify it. So he gave it to his father-in-law, Jared P. Kirtland. Kirtland, by all accounts, was an absolutely extraordinary man. He was in the first graduating class at Yale University's medical school. He moved west to Cleveland. He became a physician and a botanist and a member of the Ohio legislature. He has the Kirtland snake named after him. He has a clam named after him. He wrote the definitive book at the time of the quadrupeds of Ohio. He helped people have good food. He brought fresh water to Cleveland. His house was a stop on the Underground Railroad, getting slaves to escape from the South during the Civil War and before the Civil War. He, was just an incredible man. But for all of his knowledge, he could not identify the bird either. It just so happens that a couple of days later, Spencer Baird, who was the secretary of the Smithsonian, was traveling through Cleveland. Kirtland gave the specimen to Baird. Baird took it back to the Smithsonian and compared it to all the other specimens in the collection at the Smithsonian, and he realized that this was something new and something different. So the following year, Spencer Baird wrote a paper describing this new species, and he named it in Kirtland's honor.
Cool
Is this the
story.
Baird who the Baird sandpiper is named after?
Same guy.
Mhm.
Very cool. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome. See, now, if you bought the book and read it, I wouldn't have to tell these stories.
Did I say I highly recommend it? It was so good. I still have
great
my
book.
copy. It's really good.
Hello, Nona. How are you?
Hi, how you doing?
I'm all right. I thought I saw somebody else that I know on here. Thomas Rapai. Oh, yeah, my brother is on too. And his phone is simply pointed at the ceiling. So that sounds like my brother.
So we have a question. Is the land in the UP and in Wisconsin being actively managed for Kirtland warblers? Or are the birds just finding jack pine stands by chance?
Yes and no. The birds in Wisconsin are generally nesting on private land owned by timber companies, and they're for the most part growing red pines, which, because they're making themselves home on these red pine plantations, biologists are now saying, well, maybe we should broaden our thinking about a little bit about this. And if they're being successful in Wisconsin and red pine, maybe we could plant some more red pine here in Michigan and see what happens. In the Upper Peninsula, the land is actively being managed for the Kirtland's warbler. In Ontario, the answer is yes and no. There was some land that near Georgian Bay that was cut for a wind farm, and they moved it there. And then there's an area that'll be coming online probably next year or the year after that near Simcoe, Ontario, which is being actively managed for the Kirtland's warbler.
Excellent.
I suppose now's a moment to ask if anyone else has any wrap-up questions.
Is the DNR still doing tours, or is that suspended because of the pandemic?
Right, there will be tours this spring. They will be held only Friday, Saturday, and Sunday mornings. And I believe the sign-up website is on the Hartwick Pine State Park website. So get in there early, because I know that the tours are already filling up. They're limited to 20 people. So more than half of the slots were already filled. There are some days where they're completely filled already.
Okay, thank you, Bill.
And I think they're only going to be doing the tours in June. In past years, we'd have a couple, maybe a week into July, and July 4th would be the last day. But I think they're ending them on June 30th.
They're starting the Friday Memorial Day weekend.
Hmm.
I was fortunate enough years ago, decades ago, to be part of a DNR trip that took you into the grayling area where the warblers were nesting. And the practice was to count 2 birds for every one you heard. My question is, have you ever heard the females sing?
Generally speaking, no, the females are very quiet. I don't know that anybody has ever heard a female sing. They are pretty skulky. They're pretty quiet. They don't come up very often. So the males will sit out on a snag or on the top of a tree someplace and sing and advertise themselves. Yoo-hoo, ladies, I'm over here. But the females are like, yeah, I'm going to stay down here. Stay out of, I don't want anybody to see me. All right. Hearing no
Yeah.
more questions.
I'm so grateful that you were able to present for us today, Bill, and I hope to see you out in the field sometime
you.
soon.
I don't-
Let's give a round of applause to Bill.
Thank
for
you.
the great
A very
presentation.
quiet, muted Zoom round of applause. Thank you. And don't forget the email address. Send me your questions offline. If you're interested in the quarterly newsletter, send me an email. If you're interested in Jack Pine Planting Day, send me an email.
Mhm.
Love to have you sign up for both, preferably both.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much, Bill. I wish I could shake your hand.
Take care, everybody.
You
Thank you.
too.
And before we lose everyone here, I'll just say thanks to those people who joined
Yes.
Washtenaw Audubon recently. We've had a number of new members come through, and anyone who's interested in supporting the work we do at Washtenaw Audubon, you can go to washtenawaudubon.org and you can donate or become a member, and we'd appreciate all of your support. So thank you, everyone, and have a good night.
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that, Jessica. We need to chat after everyone leaves.
All right. Have a good night, everyone.
Great to see everyone. Thanks for coming from all over the country. It's wonderful to have everyone here.